She didn't announce it, didn't hype it, didn't need to. The gym was nearly silent. No crowd, no cameras flashing, no countdown clock ticking. Just a basketball, a net, and a player who had spent 8 months answering a question that nobody wanted to ask out loud. And then she started shooting. 1, 2, 5, 10. Shot after shot, from distances that would make most professional players hesitate. Caitlin Clark didn't hesitate. Not once. 30 consecutive three-pointers. Each one threading the net with a kind of snapping precision that doesn't come from muscle memory alone. It comes from something deeper, something that injuries quietly try to steal when no one is watching. Here's what made people stop scrolling. It wasn't just the makes. It was the manner, the way she moved between shots. No stiffness, no subtle favoring of one side, no micro adjustments that a train I would catch after ankle surgery. She moved like someone who had never left, like the 8 months were erased, like time had somehow folded back on itself. But here's what the casual viewer almost missed entirely. Midway through that same session, between reps, she caught a pass near the elbow, turned, and without looking, fired a one-handed dart into traffic. The ball arrived before the teammate had fully finished cutting, before the defense could close, before anyone in that gym had mentally processed that the window had opened. The teammate flinched in surprise, not because it was bad, because it was so fast, so certain, so complete that it bypassed every normal reaction. That's not something you train back. That's something you either still have, or you don't. And in that single moment, one of the most uncomfortable questions in the WNBA quietly got its answer. See, the real fear surrounding Caitlin Clark's return was never about her ankle. Any competent medical team can rebuild an ankle. Trainers can restore range of motion, restore strength, restore explosiveness. Those are measurable. Those are fixable. What you cannot fix with a training protocol, what you cannot schedule on a recovery timeline, is a half-second delay that creeps into elite decision-making after serious injury. It's invisible to most fans, but coaches see it, defenders exploit it, and the player herself feels it even when she pretends she doesn't. That tiny hesitation, that fraction of a second gap between reading the defense and trusting your own instinct to attack it, has derailed careers that look completely fine from the outside. Players return, put up decent numbers, move efficiently, pass all the medical checks, and yet something is off. The play that used to be automatic now takes one extra beat to execute. The pull-up that used to be fearless now comes with a shadow of doubt behind it. Over the course of a season, those shadows become losses. So when Indiana Fever fans watched that training camp footage circulate across every platform simultaneously, when it hit Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, all within hours, the reaction wasn't just excitement, it was relief. Because what they were watching wasn't just a player making shots. It was confirmation that the version of Caitlin Clark, who had rewired how this league thinks about stardom, attendance, viewership, and possibility, that version was not only back, she looked sharper. And that's where the story stops being about recovery and starts being about something the rest of the WNBA should be very, very concerned about. Because the clip was just the beginning. Behind that footage, behind those 33s and that no-look pass, there's a calculated, deliberate, almost surgical transformation happening inside the Indiana Fever organization that most analysts haven't fully mapped yet. This isn't a team crossing their fingers. This isn't a franchise riding hope. This is a roster that was built for this moment. And the blueprint they used? It goes a lot deeper than most people realize. Before training camp, before the viral footage, before the 33s and the no-look pass that broke the internet for 48 hours, the real test had already happened, and almost nobody framed it correctly. When Caitlin Clark stepped onto the floor representing Team USA in international competition, the sports world treated it like a feel-good storyline, a recovering star getting meaningful reps, a chance to shake off rust in a lower-stakes environment before the WNBA season began. That framing was completely wrong. International competition, at that level, is not a rehabilitation program. It is not a controlled environment designed to ease a player back into rhythm. The teams Clark faced were disciplined, physically prepared, and tactically briefed. Their coaching staffs had film. They had scouting reports. They had specific, detailed game plans built around one singular objective: slow Caitlin Clark down, disrupt her timing, and force her into the kind of uncomfortable moments that reveal whether a returning player truly trusts herself again. They came prepared to break her rhythm. She didn't let them find it. From the opening possessions of her first game, something was immediately clear to anyone watching with serious attention. Clark wasn't easing in. She wasn't testing the water, looking for safe reads, or choosing conservative option while her confidence rebuilt. She was dictating. She was pushing pace before defenses were set. She was pulling up from ranges that demanded complete conviction. No hesitation, no second guessing, no shadow of doubt behind the release. And the passes were what truly told the story. Because passing at the level Clark operates requires something that pure athleticism cannot manufacture. It requires seeing the floor 2 seconds ahead of everyone else. It requires trusting that the window you see right now, the one that doesn't fully exist yet, will be open by the time the ball arrives. That kind of processing is the first thing that goes quiet after serious injury. It's the last thing that comes fully back. It was fully back, play after play. Clark was delivering the ball into spaces that her teammates hadn't yet realized they were supposed to occupy. She was reading the defense's rotation before the rotation happened. She was making decisions that only work when your internal clock is running at exactly the right speed. Not slightly fast, not slightly slow, but precisely calibrated to the pace of game unfolding in front of you. Defenses adjusted. They always do against elite players. Clark adjusted faster. By the time opposing coaches were making halftime corrections, she had already processed what those corrections would be and was operating one step beyond them. That's not confidence rebuilt. That's not rust shaken off. That is a player who used 8 months away from the floor not to simply recover, but to study herself, to understand her own game at a level that only distance and forced stillness can sometimes produce. And then came the MVP award. Now, hardware gets handed out for many reasons in competitive sports. Sometimes it reflects dominance. Sometimes it reflects narrative. Sometimes it's a combination of both. But the recognition Clark received in international competition was not a consolation prize. It was not a welcome back gesture. It was a cold, statistical, film-supported conclusion that she had been the most controlled, most impactful, most unguardable player on the floor across the entire competition, against prepared defenses, without the benefit of home crowd energy, without her Indiana teammates around her, without the familiar rhythms of a full training camp already behind her. She walked into someone else's environment and owned it. That matters more than anything that could have happened in a fever practice gym, because you genuinely cannot fake instinct against defenses that are specifically designed to disrupt it. A practice setting allows for rhythm. It allows for comfort. It allows a player to look sharp in ways that might not fully translate once game pressure enters the equation. International competition with prepared opponents provides none of those safety nets. Clark didn't need them. So here's the uncomfortable truth that quietly settled over the WNBA before training camp even opened, before a single piece of viral footage had circulated, before the 33s, before the no-look pass made everyone's highlights. The question of whether Caitlin Clark was back had already been answered. The footage from training camp wasn't proof of recovery. It was confirmation of something that had already been established. And once you understand that, once you realize the real test happened earlier and she passed it completely, the conversation shifts. Because now the question isn't about Clark at all. The question becomes, what did Indiana build around her while the world was focused on her ankle? And that answer is going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. There's a moment in every franchise's history that doesn't make the front page. No press conference, no celebration, no highlight reel attached to it. It happens quietly, buried beneath bigger headlines, processed briefly, and then filed away as routine roster news. But sometimes, if you know what you're looking at, that quiet moment tells you more about a team's trajectory than any draft pick, any trade, any star's return from injury. For the Indiana Fever, that moment was Kelsey Mitchell's decision to stay. Let's put this in full context, because the casual framing of this story doesn't do it justice. Kelsey Mitchell did not enter this offseason from a position of uncertainty. She didn't return from a down year looking for stability. She didn't need Indiana the way a player searching for a role needs a team willing to give her one. She came into free agency as one of the most productive guards in the entire league, coming off the strongest individual season of her career, with scoring numbers that franchises around the WNBA would restructure their offenses to accommodate. Players with her profile don't just receive interest in free agency. They receive pursuit, aggressive, financially serious pursuit from organizations that have studied the film, identified the need, and arrive at the table with real offers designed to win the negotiation. Mitchell had options, real ones, the kind of options that, historically, players take. She didn't take them. And the more you sit with that, the more you think about what it means for a player at the peak of her market value to look at what's available elsewhere and choose to stay, the more the weight of it begins to settle. Because this wasn't sentimentality. Elite athletes at this level don't make career decisions based on comfort alone. They make them based on belief. And what Mitchell's decision signals, loudly, even in its silence, is that she believes what's being built in Indiana is more valuable than anything the open market was offering her. Think about what she was choosing to stay inside. A system anchored by a player who had just spent 8 months in recovery. A franchise still in a relatively early stage of its competitive rebuild. A roster still proving itself against the league's established powers. From the outside, the case for leaving looked reasonable. From the outside, the case for maximizing value elsewhere made logical sense. But Mitchell had information the outside didn't have. She had been inside the building. She had watched how this coaching staff operated under pressure. She had seen how this organization responded when things broke down, not in press releases and carefully managed public statements, but in the private moments that reveal whether leadership actually knows what it's doing. She had practiced alongside Clark long enough to understand not just what Clark could do at full health, but what the combination of their specific skill sets could produce when operating in the same system simultaneously. And she decided that combination was worth more than a bigger contract somewhere else. That's not a small thing. That a player telling you, without words, through the most definitive action available to her, that the ceiling she sees from inside Indiana's program is higher than what she could access anywhere else. Now layer that with something most analysts glossed over in their coverage of this decision. Mitchell's game doesn't just complement Clark's. It stresses defenses in a completely different dimension. Clark commands attention from perimeter, pulling coverages outward, forcing rotations, creating the kind of gravity that opens lanes for everyone around her. Mitchell attacks those exact lanes with speed and finishing ability that punishes any defense that even slightly overcommits to limiting Clark's impact. They don't just coexist. They make each other harder to guard. Double Clark. Mitchell burns you in transition. Shade too far toward Mitchell's driving lanes. Clark makes you pay from distances most players won't even attempt. The decision a defense has to make when both are on the floor together isn't just difficult. It's a trap. Every correct answer to one problem creates a new, equally threatening problem somewhere else. That dynamic existed last season. But last season came with asterisks, injuries, chemistry still forming, systems still being installed. The full version of what that pairing could produce never had a clean, extended stretch to prove itself. This season is different. Mitchell stayed specifically because she has seen what the full version looks like in practice. And if what she's seen in that gym, with Clark healthy, with the system refined, with the roster built around creating exactly this kind of defensive impossibility, if that's what convinced her to stay, then the rest of the league should be paying very close attention. Because Mitchell isn't the only piece Indiana moved deliberately this offseason. There are others. And when you line them up together, when you trace every roster decision back to the specific breakdowns from last season, a pattern emerges that makes this team look less like a group hoping things come together and more like an organization that already knows exactly how this plays out. The blueprint is sharper than anyone is admitting, and we're just getting started uncovering it. Most teams respond to failure the same way. They make changes that look decisive. They move pieces around, generate headlines, signal to their fan base that something is different now. And then the season starts and the same fundamental problems resurface, dressed in new uniforms but identical in structure. Indiana didn't do that. What this franchise did in the offseason was something far less visible and far more dangerous. They went back to film, identified the exact moments where last season broke down, and made surgical decisions designed to eliminate those specific vulnerabilities, not general weaknesses, not vague areas of improvement, specific, identifiable, time-stamped breakdowns that a coaching staff with genuine self-awareness could trace back to their roots. And here's why that matters. Because the difference between a team that reacts to failure and a team that studies, it is the difference between short-term adjustment and long-term dominance. Let's go back to what actually broke down. When Indiana faced elite defensive pressure last season, the kind that showed up in playoff-caliber games against organized, physical opponents, there were consistent patterns in how things fell apart. Clark would draw the primary coverage. Defenses would funnel ball handlers toward help defenders positioned specifically to cut off driving lanes and force the ball back out. Indiana's offense would reset, possessions would extend, and gradually, the natural rhythm of their attack would stall into something slower and more predictable than what this roster is actually capable of producing. That's not a talent problem. That's a spacing problem, a decision-making under pressure problem, a depth problem that surfaces the moment a starting unit needs its bench to maintain offensive structure without losing intensity. Indiana studied every one of those moments. Then they addressed them quietly, precisely, without fanfare. The additions this franchise made weren't splashy. They weren't the kind of moves that dominate offseason trade coverage or generate national conversation. They were targeted. Players selected not for raw individual upside, but for how their specific skill sets would interact with the existing core. Players who could maintain spacing when Clark drew double coverage. Players who understood pace and wouldn't slow the game down to a walk when the starting unit rested. Players whose defensive versatility would reduce the number of mismatches opponents could manufacture in crunch time. This is how contenders are actually built, not by accumulating talent and hoping it coheres, by identifying what broke you last time and rebuilding with ruthless specificity around those fracture points. But here's the layer of this that almost nobody discussed publicly, and it's the layer that changes how you read Indiana's ceiling entirely. The coaching staff didn't just address roster weaknesses. They addressed systemic ones. They looked at how they were deploying Clark in high-leverage situations, where she was operating on the floor, what reads she was being asked to make, what kind of spacing she had available when defenses committed to taking away her primary options, and they rebuilt the system's decision tree around a more complete picture of what she can do at full health. Because here's a truth about last season that got buried under injury narratives and learning curve discussions. Indiana never saw a fully healthy, fully calibrated Caitlin Clark operating inside a fully optimized system for an extended stretch. Those things were never simultaneously true for long enough to measure what this team's real ceiling is. Opponents were essentially game plan testing a version of Indiana that was perpetually incomplete. That changes everything about how you scout them this season. Defenses built their Clark playbooks around a player still developing her command of the specific offense, still building on-floor chemistry with teammates who were themselves still learning how to maximize the gravity she creates. Those playbooks are already outdated. The player those scouting reports were written about no longer exists, not because Clark is transformed into someone unrecognizable, but because the system around her has caught up to what she's actually capable of demanding from it. The spacing is cleaner. The reads are faster. The options she has when her primary look disappears are more dangerous than they were 12 months ago. And defenses won't know exactly how outdated their preparation is until they're already in the middle of the game, watching plays develop in ways their film sessions didn't fully anticipate. That's the trap Indiana has quietly set. The viral training camp footage, the Mitchell signing, the roster additions, none of these exist in isolation. They are individual pieces of coherent, deliberate construction, each one solving a specific problem, each one fitting into a larger design that only becomes fully visible when you step back and look at the complete picture. And when you do step back, the picture is striking, because what Indiana has assembled isn't a team hoping to compete. It's a team built with the specific architecture of a champion. And there's one more piece to this blueprint, arguably the most important one, that nobody has properly examined yet. It has nothing to do with roster construction. It has everything to do with what Caitlin Clark learned about herself during those 8 months away from the game. There's a version of forced stillness that breaks athletes. and there's a version that builds them into something the game hasn't seen yet. The difference between those two outcomes almost never comes down to physical recovery. It comes down to what a competitor chooses to do with the mental space that injury creates. The long, uncomfortable hours when the body can't perform, but the mind refuses to stop processing. For most players, that space becomes a source of anxiety. Every day away from the floor feels like erosion. Every game watched from the sideline feels like distance growing between them and the player they were. The psychological weight of absence compounds quietly, and by the time the body is ready to return, the mind has spent months rehearsing doubt. Caitlin Clark didn't use that time that way, and understanding how she did use it is arguably the most important part of this entire story, because it explains something about the training camp footage that goes deeper than 30 made threes or a single no-look pass. Here's what almost nobody talks about when discussing elite point guards at Clark's level: the cognitive ceiling of the position. The physical tools matter. The shooting range matters. The athleticism matters. But what separates genuinely transformative floor generals from merely excellent players is the ability to process the game at a speed that creates advantages before opponents can even recognize a situation has developed. That processing speed isn't static. It can be trained. It can be refined. And paradoxically, it can sometimes be accelerated by a period away from active competition, when a player finally has the stillness to study the game at a depth that the relentless pace of a season never allows. Clark had 8 months of that stillness. People close to the situation describe her approach during recovery not as a player waiting to get back, but as a student systematically dismantling everything she knew about her own game and reassembling it with greater precision. She watched film obsessively, not highlight packages, not broad game recaps. Specific possessions, specific defensive rotations, specific moments where her decisions had been reactive rather than proactive. She was studying the gap between what she did and what she could have done. That's not a normal recovery mindset. That's a mindset of someone who looked at an 8-month interruption and made a deliberate choice. This time is not going to be lost time. This time is going to be investment time. And the returns on that investment showed up in ways that are subtle enough to miss if you're only watching the obvious metrics. Watch Clark's movement patterns in the early training camp footage. Not her shooting, her movement. The way she positions herself before the ball arrives. The angle she uses to receive passes. The footwork she establishes before she's even decided what the play will be. These are the micro details that coaching staffs notice and analysts rarely discuss publicly because they require frame-by-frame attention that broadcast coverage doesn't provide. What those details reveal is a player who spent 8 months refining the preparation phase of her decisions. The part that happens before the obvious action, before the shot or the pass or the drive. She got fast in the spaces that don't show up on a box score. Her reads are cleaner at the start of possessions, meaning she's operating from better information earlier. Her off-ball positioning is sharper, meaning she's arriving at decision points in better physical shape to execute. Her shot selection in early camp footage shows a player who has internalized, at a deeper level than before, the difference between a good shot and the best available shot in any given possession. That last point is significant, because one of the subtle critiques occasionally attached to Clark's game, even by admirers, was a tendency toward the spectacular when the efficient option existed. The extraordinary pass when the simple pass accomplished the same thing. The degree of difficulty shot when a more straightforward look was available. Not a fatal flaw, not even a consistent pattern, but a thread that disciplined defensive coordinators would occasionally pull on to create discomfort. That thread appears to have been quietly addressed. What's emerging in the early footage isn't a less dynamic Clark. It's a more decisive one. A player who still has every weapon she arrived with, the range, the vision, the passing creativity that makes her genuinely unique at this level, but who now wields those weapons with selectivity that makes each of them individually more effective. Efficiency layered onto brilliance. That combination is genuinely rare. Most players either have the brilliance without the efficiency, or the efficiency without the brilliance. The players who develop both simultaneously, who learn to be spectacular and ruthlessly smart about when spectacular is actually necessary, are the ones who redefine what a position looks like. Clark appears to be at that threshold, and here's where that becomes a nightmare for opposing coaches. Because you can game plan for brilliant, you can game plan for efficient, You can design defensive systems that punish predictability, and you can design systems that take away high-difficulty shots. But a player who can move fluidly between both modes, who can be devastating in multiple registers and choose between them in real time based on what the defense gives her, that player requires a different kind of preparation entirely. Preparation that may not fully exist yet, because nobody has faced this version of Clark in a full WNBA regular season yet. And by the time defenses figure out that their old playbooks are obsolete, Indiana will already have the lead. But Clark's evolution is only half of what makes this Fever team genuinely threatening. Because while she was in that stillness, studying herself, refining her game at a molecular level, something else was happening inside the Indiana organization. Something that had nothing to do with roster moves or coaching adjustments. It had to do with culture, and what was quietly built inside that locker room during the hardest stretch of this franchise's recent history. Part 6, What Built Inside the Silence. Championships are not won in arenas. They are won in the moments nobody films. The conversations that happen after practice when the cameras are gone. The decisions made in training rooms at 6 in the morning when showing up is entirely optional. The quiet, unglamorous accumulation of trust between people who've been through something genuinely difficult together and chosen, repeatedly, to stay. Indiana Fever had one of those stretches last season. And what came out of it, what was quietly forged inside that difficulty, is the part of this team story that statistics will never fully capture and national coverage almost entirely missed. Let's be honest about what last season actually was for this franchise. It wasn't a disappointment in the traditional sense. The bar had been raised dramatically by Clark's arrival, by the surge in attention, by the genuine excitement of a fan base that had waited a long time for something to believe in. Expectations arrived before the foundation was fully built. And when injuries intervened, when the player those expectations were anchored to was suddenly absent, what remained was a group of women who had to decide, in real time, what kind of team they actually were beneath the star power and the spotlight. That question doesn't get answered in press conferences. It gets answered in practice, in film sessions, in the way veterans respond when younger players struggle, in the way a coaching staff communicates when the easy narrative disappears, and the hard work has to speak for itself. What Indiana's answer revealed was something genuinely important. This team didn't fracture. It didn't retreat into individual agendas when a collective dream became harder to chase. The players who remained healthy didn't shrink from the additional responsibility thrust onto them. They expanded into it. They competed with an intensity that had nothing to do with the cameras that followed the franchise into the season, and everything to do with genuine investment in each other's success. Kelsey Mitchell's performance during Clark's absence told that story more clearly than anything else could, because Mitchell didn't coast, didn't treat the situation as a holding pattern, a season to endure until the real team reassembled. She attacked, she led, she produced at a level that forced the entire league to recalibrate how seriously it took Indiana, even without its most recognizable player on the floor. And in doing so, she did something that roster construction alone can never manufacture. She demonstrated that this team's competitive identity existed independently of any single player. That matters enormously. Here's why. The most vulnerable franchises in professional sports are the ones whose culture lives entirely inside their star. When the star is present, everything functions. When the star is absent, the system collapses because the system was never really a system. It was just one exceptional player surrounded by people waiting for direction. Indiana proved last season that it isn't that franchise. The culture inside that locker room is real. It was tested under genuinely difficult conditions, and it held. And now that the star is back, healthy, operating at a level that appears to exceed even pre-injury form, that culture doesn't just continue, it amplifies. Because here's what changes when a team that developed genuine cohesion through adversity gets its best player back at full capacity. The trust is already established. The roles are already understood. The habits of competing hard regardless of circumstance are already embedded at a level that only real difficulty produces. Clark doesn't return to a group that needs to rebuild its confidence around her. She returns to a group that already has its confidence, that already knows what it's capable of without her, that can now operate as a complete unit, without the psychological dependency that makes star-heavy teams brittle when pressure arrives. That's not a minor advantage. In close games, in elimination scenarios, in the moments when the outcome is genuinely uncertain and mental toughness becomes a deciding variable, teams with real culture beat teams with assembled talent more often than the talent differential would suggest. Indiana has both now: talent and culture, star power and collective identity, individual brilliance and genuine team cohesion. Those combinations don't come together often. When they do, the results tend to be sustained, not accidental. But there's another dimension to what was built inside Indiana's program during this period, one that involves the coaching staff specifically and the adjustments they made that are going to shock opponents who prepared for last year's version of this team. Coach Christie's sides didn't use the difficult stretch of last season as a waiting period either.